The National Museum of Funeral History presents The Final Curtain Never Closes. I'm your host, Genevieve Keeney-Vazquez, the president and CEO of the museum. Genevieve Keeney-Vazquez, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really looking forward to talking with you. As some of our listeners know, every year I do a series related to death, and last year we did death and dying, and this year we're focused on death rituals. You have such a rich background and also your own personal stories. I'm just thrilled that you've agreed to join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Whenever I get an opportunity to speak about what the museum actually houses and all of the amazing exhibits, the wealth of education and knowledge that the museum possesses, I jump on that opportunity because I think there's nothing more important in life to talk about than death. It's a hard subject to talk about. Nobody wants to talk about it. And when we're faced with it, we still don't want to believe it. It's just one of those things society has kind of evolved into over time where death becomes more and more a distant topic. However, it's quite entertaining. So it really puts us in a very mismatched or unbalanced relationship with death.
Yeah. And you just shared with me before we started recording that you lost your mother last week. So I know this is going to be even more personal. And my first question is always hearing about where you grew up and what kind of kid you were. And that might bring up some emotional things as well. So let's just take it as it comes and what's comfortable for you and whatever you're willing to share with listeners today.
Oh, I appreciate it. Yeah. So, I'm going to be my authentic self. I am definitely in my throes of grief. Like I said, yesterday I was focused, the fog had lifted, and today the fog is back. So it's true. I have lost people in the past in my life. Nothing to prepare you to lose your mother. I think that ranks right up there with losing a child. Yeah. Somebody who nurtured you and then somebody you nurtured. There's the circle of life that we all are educated on. We're born and then we die. The order of life is that you bury your parents. But sometimes when that order gets out of place, it really throws you for a loop and kind of gets you off balance. But still, even though it is a normal cycle of life for you to bury your parent, it still never prepares you for the actual moment.
Yeah, I lost my father almost 11 years ago now, and he was sick for 14 years, so we knew it was coming, and yet when it came, it still was so shocking. And that is actually the reason I wanted to start having this conversation on a regular basis about death, because I think no matter how much, on the one hand, no matter how much you prepare yourself, you can't prepare yourself. But on the other hand, if you don't talk about it and prepare yourself, it's even more difficult. So I think you said this to me in a previous conversation, and I completely agree. Like, death is the most inevitable thing in our lives, and yet we sort of push it away. And so your museum and all of the things we can do to have conversations about death and prepare for it. What do we want at death? What do our loved ones want? So that we know that we're honoring them the way that they wanted to be honored. I think all of these things may seem small, but they can have a really big difference in the peace that we can find ultimately, whether it's a loved one, a close friend, what have you.
It's interesting, if I can divert for a moment, when you said having that conversation and being prepared. I was sitting at the funeral home last week, and I had my two oldest daughters with me, kind of being my brain in the moments of the choices in making for mom's funeral arrangements. And I was talking about having a space in the cemetery for all of us to be, because we're a family of cremation pretty much. So right now, I would say we're collecting urns, if you will. And I'm being mindful of the thought that my children or my grandchildren, unfortunately, don't want to inherit maybe 7 urns down the road, right? It's like, it's not fair to them. And I don't want us to be abandoned ashes either. So I thought, well, now's the time I need to start thinking about getting some type of permanent placement for the urns that we currently have in the family of my sister and my stepmother, and now my mother, what that looks like. And I looked to one of my daughters and I said, okay, I said, are you okay if I just get like a family niche space that can house all of us? If other family members need a place to rest, they can join us in that space. She said, yeah. And I looked to my other daughter and she looked at me like stern. She had the sternest look in her face and she said, oh, no, I'm not going there. You just scatter me. I don't want to be around. And I was really taken back by that in a moment of, wow, I didn't know this about my daughter, but how important this is to her, because I would have put her in a niche space to keep her close, but that's not her wish. And this was the first time she ever communicated that to me. And so I think it's really important that we have those conversations, as hard as they are, to really kind of bring out what somebody believes is best for them once they leave this earth. What do we do with their remains?
So you can honor them, and there's nothing more we want to do with loved ones than honor them. But if we don't know, or if we're guessing, right, then I think that just like adds anxiety at the time of preparing for however we're going to, memorialize them. So thank you for sharing that.
I always like to tell people that funeral directors, we are taught the tradition of disposition, right? You have two forms of disposition. You have burial, you have cremation. You have to choose one of those at time of death. And if you haven't had that conversation to understand what your final party is going to look like, do you want to be buried? Do you want to be cremated? Do you want to have a visitation? Do you want to have a funeral? Do you want to have an open casket or a closed casket? All of these questions. If you do not think that ahead of time when you're not distracted by grief, you're going to end up with a traditional funeral, because that's what we're taught to do, is give you a traditional funeral that will encompass the basics of preparing your body for its final resting place, whether it's in burial form or cremation form. And sometimes when people look back on it, they're like, oh, I wish I would have done this. I did it with my own sister. And I just had graduated from funeral directing school when my sister passed away. And there were a lot of things I had learned, but didn't know I could do for my sister. And I wasn't really involved in the funeral planning because she passed away in California and I was here in Houston. And so there was a distance in that. But now I'm in the throes of being the one planning for my mother's funeral. And being a funeral director that I am, I'm able to incorporate a lot of the thoughts that I've had on what I wanted for my mom. And I have to say, it's probably the most empowering feeling that one can have in a very powerless situation.
Yeah. And were you able to have discussions with your mother about what she wanted in the intervening years?
Oh, yeah, we did. One time I was at a conference for the industry, and, sometimes when you're in the conferences, a lot of them are like, oh, take this urn back. I don't want to take it back. It's too heavy. I don't want to travel with it. You guys want it? And there was this beautiful, beautiful banded calcite urn. And I took it home. It was just a gorgeous vase. And my mom fell in love with it. And I'm talking like 12 years ago. And I said, Ma, I said, do you want it to be your urn? She says, most definitely. So for 12 years, my mama's urn sat on a shelf as a vase, as decoration.
Love that story.
And so she always knew where her final resting place was. And I think that she had some peace in that.
Yeah.
Even as hard as it was, my mom's favorite candy is Neckos. And one day I noticed that, the dementia started changing her, and she started withdrawing from her favorite candy. And I went up to her probably about 3 months ago, and I just held the Necco in my hand. I said, Mama, everyone at your funeral is going to get a Necco, because that's how I remember her. That special candy. I mean, I would go into a dollar store and put the whole box at the cash register, and they'd look at me and they're like, you want the whole box? I'm like, yeah, I'm not coming to the store every other day for a Necco. I'm getting the whole box. My mom could go through some Neccos in a couple of weeks. So needless to say, today, after this, I will be going and getting 2 boxes of Neccos for the funeral. So
Absolutely.
That's promised. Everyone will go home with a Necco, whether they like the candy or not.
Right. That's not the point.
Yeah.
And did she start eating them when she was a child? Do you know the story of that?
I really don't know the story of it, but she had to have maybe started eating them as a child, because as long as I can remember, my mom always had Neccos around all the time. I would mistaken them for coins.
That's so funny. And at the end of every episode, I ask a couple of questions, and one of them is, and we'll get to it, about an object that has a lot of meaning to you. And the reason I ask that is because objects are just vessels for memories, and so whether it's candy or we had this cookie jar growing up, it was like a ceramic rabbit, and you took the ears off and the cookies went inside. And there's just these things that are like wrapped into our memories in such a wonderful way. And I feel like objects sort of like are just vessels for those memories. So that's such a beautiful one.
And another thing they say is wonderful for memories is smell.
Yes.
Your oral factor can bring back memories like there's no tomorrow. That's another thing. I actually have my grandmother's wallet that I have put into a Ziploc bag. And my grandmother passed away. Oh, wow. I think it's been almost 20 years now. I can open that bag and I can still smell my grandma.
That's amazing. I've had that experience really once I can remember. My dad, when I was very young, smoked a pipe, and a pipe has like a very, very specific smell. And years later, I was walking down a street and I smelled a pipe, and I just got all these memories of my dad. It was crazy.
Yeah.
So I know that can happen. But I love this idea of preserving a smell of somebody that's died in a Ziploc or something that will like hold the smell. So that's not something I thought about, and I really like that idea. So tell us where you grew up and what kind of kid you were.
So I grew up I was born in California, San Diego, California. And then when I was about 3 years old, my parents moved to Colorado. I was a very adventurous kid. I look back on my childhood, I'm surprised I survived it. It was that childhood where you got up in the morning, you went out and played, and you didn't come home until the sun had come down. And you played with freedom, carelessness, and just adventure seeking all of the time. I think some of my adventurous play was definitely intertwined with my unknown. And when I say this word, I'm not saying it in a morbid way. I'm saying it in a very curiosity kind of format. But my fascination with death was like, it was implanted at a very young age at 7, because I had that seeking and wanting to understand what death was, what death looked like, what does the body go through before, during, and after death. Really, unbeknownst to me at that age, I was already scientifically thinking of death in a scientific manner. And so my curiosity really, I think, drove a lot of my adventures as a child. I would find myself doing stuff that, potentially kill me, but I wasn't doing it because I wanted to die, but I was doing it because I was searching for a body, if you will, because of what I had heard when I was 7 years old on a newscast. A baby was found in a trash can, unfortunately. And my brother and I used to go pop can collecting to get money for candy. It was during one weekend that we had our choice to go pop can collecting or go play with our friends. We had a competitor down the street of where we lived that also did pop can collecting, but I think he did his to pay his bills. We did ours for candy. And he went out pop can collecting that day. So we tend to kind of go along the same routes, if you will, the same trash cans and stuff to get the cans. And that day he had found the baby. And I remember laying on the top bunk of the bed, hearing the news story from the other room, and looked down at my brother and I said, that could have been us. We could have found it. And I just have this weird canny ability to find things. My husband says I find everything, and I will search until I find it. So never ask me to look for something, because I will not stop till I find it. And again, I think that concept came from that moment in time. A lot of things came out of that moment that ended up basically giving me it paved my life to where I am today. I can look back at that moment and say that's where it all began. I consistently was wanting to know what that baby looked like. What does a baby look like when they're dead? And it could be a baby, it could be a person, it could be an animal. And in that time, we didn't have access to the technology that we do today. I mean, today you can just do a Google search and I could have gotten that answer, right, of what death looks like. But it wasn't available. Death was really a protected subject back then, it seems. It was more professionally driven. Like you had to be in the profession to really be in touch with it or to be next to it. And so that became my next step of trying to cultivate a profession that I could be exposed to death and get those answers that I was seeking. And that's when I joined the military so that I could have money to gain an education, to become a professional who works in the profession and caring for the dead, be it a coroner, a funeral director, a grief counselor, whatever it is. And, I was aiming to be a coroner in the 9th grade. This is how in touch with death I really became in my young adult life. In my sophomore year of high school, we had to do a speech for Speaking 101 class. And I hated public speaking. I'm great at it now. Back then, I was just starting out. And I had learned that I had an older brother. And he had died 33 minutes old. And I was very curious, and I asked my mom, where is my brother? And she said, well, he's in the storage at the cemetery. And I said, why is he in the storage? Why is he not in the ground? At this time in my life, I really hadn't had any relatives die close to me to be able to go to a cemetery and visit. It was very still foreign to me. And so I said, well, I want to bring him home. He doesn't need to be in storage. Unfortunately, my parents didn't have the money for burial and a headstone back then. So they just had him cremated, and then he was forever stored. And I raised $45 and I went and got him out of storage. He was in this metal box that I literally had to have like a crowbar to break into, and peeled back this metal box. And there for the first time, I saw what death looked like in a cremated form. And not only was I just looking at death, but I was looking at my brother that I had never met before. So it was a very profound, impactful moment. And I went and got a little Q-tip box you can get at the 99-cent store. I put him in there, sealed it up so that nothing could fall out, and took him to my Speaking 101 class, and my topic was cremation.
Wow, in 9th grade.
In 9th grade.
And you brought your brother.
And I brought my brother to school, and I passed him around class, and everyone looked at him. I say that with great respect and love for my brother, but it was nice having my brother in class that day. Looking back on it, kind of helped me get through the speaking jitters, if you will.
And it would be so interesting if you could talk to some of your classmates today and understand the impact that had on their lives. I don't know if you're in touch with any of them, but I feel like that would be fascinating.
That really would be, because I often wonder how people took that, right? And it was interesting because there was, looking back on it, there were just a couple students that were, I want to say like shocked and like, ew factor. But the majority of the class was intrigued. Yeah. They were curious. They were curious just like I was. And so it ended up going over very well. I didn't, the teacher was accepting of it. The school was accepting of it. And rightfully, they should be, right? Because it's part of life.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And
then, so you were a U.S. Army medic. Is that
yes.
correct? And so you talked a little bit about that being sort of a means to education. I was thinking that experience had to also teach you about death and in some way shape your thoughts on death and maybe your transition to becoming a funeral director instead of a coroner, or is that not the case?
Oh, it is completely the case.
Okay.
You are 100% on spot. Because, when I was in high school, and obviously I continued to culminate my death curiosities. When I was a senior, we had to do a career day. And of course, my career day was on a coroner. And whenever I would go sit with my counselors and try and tell them what I wanted to do in life, they were like, we're not sure how to tell you what path to take, what classes to take, what degree to get. It was very foreign to them. So I really had to reach out to the professionals to understand my path. And I interviewed a coroner and found out through him that I could go into law or I could go into medicine. And I learned medicine came very easy to me. So I chose the medicine route, hence going into the Army and becoming a medic so that I can be exposed to the medical world, as well as be able to go to college so that I could get the degrees needed to come back and be a coroner. And that was my thought process at the time. Jumped into the Army, and my first duty station, there wasn't a lot of exposure on death. It was more about learning what I needed to do to be a soldier, learning the culture, learning the environment, as well as I had children at the time. and so being a parent at the same time. So there really wasn't a whole lot of room for education at that time. And then was really when I joined, basically when I got a new duty station in Germany, that really excelled my educational opportunities as well as my exposure to death in ways I never knew. I never had an idea that that was awaiting me. So I was working as an Army medic in a clinic over in Germany, and I learned serendipitously that the clinic was responsible for handling any deaths within our theater. And when I say within our theater, it's the region that falls under a larger umbrella, a regional umbrella. And our clinic was one of those clinics within the region. So we were responsible for several regions. And a death happened. Before I knew it, they're like, oh, we need the records clerk and we need a medic to go with us and we need a doctor. And I perked up and I was like, what is this about? What's happening? And of course, nobody wanted to volunteer to go bag and tag is the term. And I raised my hand and said, take me, I want to go. And this was my first time I was ever going to actually see a dead body in my life. Before I had seen it in photos when I went and interviewed the coroner. I was too young. I didn't have parental permission to see an actual body. I had to see a photo. And here I was going. I was so nervous. And so I have to say that it was almost like fireworks going off inside of me, right? You have the nervousness, you have the excitement, you have the unknown, you have this fear. It's all wrapped up into one. And I went in there, but at the same time, I said, I'm the professional. I have to be the professional in this situation. And it was a soldier who unfortunately had overdosed and was found in his barracks room. And we had to go in and take care of him. And I was just like a big sponge at the same time. I was really absorbing the scene and seeing everybody that was involved. And at the end of the day, they looked to us for all of the right things to do with the body. So we had a couple more incidents where taking care of dead bodies was involved and the clinic had to respond. But it was a process that had a lot of holes in it. And so after a couple of times, I had asked them if I could accompany a body to launch stool and witness the autopsy, the embalming, see the whole process from start to finish, because I was finding myself calling funeral directors back in the United States. There were so many steps, so many people involved. And I said, well, here we are doing this again, and there's a bunch of holes. So I created a death reaction team and kind of created an SOP, keeping in mind that an SOP for one situation is not going to be textbook for the next. You have to have modifications within it because every death is different.
Right. And just for listeners who don't know, an SOP is a standard operating procedure. So just like the steps to go through.
If the subject matter expert is not there, then that SOP, that standard operating procedure booklet, can be picked up and somebody can do the same job by reading what needs to be done. It's kind of
shocking they didn't have that, but that's amazing that you created that.
And the reason why they didn't have it is because 9 times out of 10, the people that go over into the European theater or get deployed, whether it's the soldier and their families are going over, we have to go through very strict medical evaluations to deem us healthy enough to go there. Granted, there are times that some people will be healthy and then their health conditions can change, or they get into an accident or like an overdose, things that are unforeseen. But the majority of the time, people going over there are going to be healthy, younger population that's going into the European region or even foreign countries. Unless it's war, of course, then that's a whole different story.
Right.
So death is not something that you are exposed to very often there. And your time there is also limited. If you're single, you're only going to be there for 2 years. If you're married, you'll be there for 3 years if you have your family with you. But I was one of those people that I really love my environment. I don't like a lot of change. And so I upped to stay. And so I was there for 6 years. So being there for so long, I was able to be exposed to a lot more. And people are always changing. And
create processes that hopefully they, shared in other regions.
Yeah, actually they did, because it became the first body we ever had to process and get, basically to launch stool. It took us almost 2 days because there was so much known or who's responsible for this. And so we went from a 2-day process of removing a body from our immediate area to being able to get a body processed and out within 18 hours.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was a very positive thing. When you have family, sometimes it takes a little longer, but when you don't have family there, then it can be pretty expeditious.
And you talk a lot about respect for the body, which I think is in this whole series I'm doing on death rituals, I think is going to be the constant, and different like cultures, and we'll get into it in the museum. Even, I would say, like subcultures within our country, regional cultures, religious cultures. I mean, there are all kinds of different cultures and different ways to respect the body, but I think everybody wants to respect a dead body. So how did that make you change from wanting to be a coroner to a funeral director?
I'd learned that I became quite the advocate for the deceased while I was there. And you were talking about rituals, and I'm going to talk about a few of them that I did experience there, where my advocacy actually made a difference. So that's where I shifted from being a coroner that was just going to be the ones that the only time you're interacting with death is opening the body and trying to figure out what caused that body to cease its life, to being an advocate, you're still involved with the body, but you're also involved with the family. I think there was a lot more opportunities to be a contributing factor in a positive way as a funeral director than as a coroner. So it became more of a better fit for me. And, the first time I have to say my advocacy really stepped in was when a mother had lost her child. She was pregnant, and she unfortunately delivered the baby in what they call the Frau Clinic, which is a woman's clinic there locally. And you have different laws. So you have laws if death happens on an actual base, an Army base, or if the death happens out on the economy, we call it, which is the local economy that's hosting your base, right? So if you're within the base, then you just have to worry about the military personnel. The military personnel are 100% responsible for the body. It stays within the military realm. But once that body dies in the economy, now you have to get the host nation officials involved. And now it becomes a bigger production, right? This lady, unfortunately, she went into early labor. They took her to the women's clinic. She unfortunately delivered the baby. The baby didn't survive. They took the baby to the hospital because they were trying to save the baby. So the baby got immediately transferred to the hospital. So now you have the baby in the hospital and you have the mother in the woman's clinic, and they're completely two different places. And now you're trying to work with the local nationals and their customs and rituals on transporting a body. We have what we call our host nation liaisons that work within our clinic, and they're the ones that help us communicate with the hospitals in the economy with the military. And so I immediately went to our liaison. I said, I have a baby in the hospital. I have a mother in the women's clinic. I need her to do identification of remains because we couldn't get a hold of the father. And because I have paperwork I have to do. And he says, well, put the baby in a basket and take it to the clinic. And I said, no, I'm like, excuse me? I'm going to do what? He's like, well, that's what we do in the past. We just put them in our car and take them where they need to be. And I was like, whoa, okay, no, that's not happening. That's not how we do things. So it's like, I have to follow the policies. I'm not going to be responsible for carrying a dead baby in a basket to the woman's clinic. That's crossing the line for me. As much as I would love to rejoin the mother and her child, I have policies and procedures that I have to abide by. And so they said, and the reason why at the moment I couldn't get the mother to the hospital, because I'm sure listeners are being like, well, take the mom to the hospital. The mother was anemic. She had lost a lot of blood. And due to her religion, she refused a blood transfusion. So she was too weak to leave the woman's clinic to go to the hospital. So we just said, okay, there's no rush here. Let's wait a couple of days. Let's let her get stronger, and then we'll take the mother to the hospital. So that's what ended up happening. So I get down to the morgue. I'm with the mother. She's in her wheelchair. I bring the baby out, and I bring the camera out. Well, now the German mortician looks at me and goes, what are you doing? You can't do that. And I said, I'm taking a picture for the mother to have with her child. Oh, no. We don't take pictures of the dead. I said, that's your culture. Your culture doesn't appreciate photos of the dead. Her culture does. And she needs this for her. So I literally had a little battle with him right there in the morgue, telling him the difference in cultures. What's acceptable for one person may not be acceptable for another. But we have to learn, especially at time of death, to bend and give way to somebody else's beliefs. And in that moment, I realized I have a little power here.
Yeah.
In a positive way.
And you were able to give something to the mother that she needed.
Yes. I mean, this is the first time she's able to see her baby. Yeah. And this is going to be the last time that she's going to be able to see her baby. And I needed to create those memories for her. That was my second experience with death. My first one was the soldier in the barracks who died of an overdose. And then there was this infant. And not even 2 days later, after the infant died, I get called into the office and they said, we just had a murder-suicide. And we need you to go to the scene. And I looked at her and I said, are you guys just playing with me? Are you guys just trying to see how good I can do this job and seeing how much stress I can take? And they're like, no, we're not messing with you. It's real. And it was just down the street. A soldier his wife wanted to leave him and go back to the United States, and he couldn't handle it. And so he followed her from their location, which was about 25 minutes away from us, to where she was staying down by us. And he followed her out on the streets and shot at her, got out, shot and killed her, and then killed himself. So I had 2 bodies now on the street that are both Americans. And one's a service member and one's a family member. And I remember getting to the scene, and again, a lot of players came out. And there was a lot of people, unfortunately. And the media was there. They were taking pictures. The bodies weren't covered. They were still in the same position that they had died in. And it just seemed like there was like a bunch of people just buzzing around and nobody was attending to the dead. And in that moment, I looked and I said, does anybody have blankets, sheets, anything? We need to cover them. And luckily, the woman had blankets in her car. And I immediately went in and I took the blankets out and I covered them because in our culture, that is a form of respect. You cover the dead. You shield them. You give them that protection in that time of death. And that's what I did. And then we had to, of course, take them to the local national cemetery, which culturally, they don't open on the weekends. Us, we work 24/7. You got to do what you got to do to get the job done. And I literally had to call the mayor to demand that the funeral home open on the weekend so that I could get the commander to come down and do identification of remains. So again, there's that bend that I had to implement and get them to bend to what we needed in our process and in our culture. This is how we do things.
So then after your 6 years, you became a funeral director, and then you came to be the executive director of the museum. So walk us through that and the time frame.
Yeah. So when I was learning the process of taking care of the bodies, I went to my commander and said, I need to follow these bodies so that I can really create a great, solid plan of action. And he let me take 2 days off and follow the bodies up to Launchstoel, follow them for the autopsy. And this was a very profound turning moment. And it's a poignant story that I would love to share. I remember, here I am in the autopsy room. Remember, I wanted to be a coroner. So I'm now in the throes of what I've been seeking so long as a child. I am standing in that moment. I am at the table. I am with the pathologist. And we are about ready to open up this body. And I'm going to see the things I have been searching for and seeking to see since I was 7. I remember I was in my full garb and they started turning the table around to get the pictures from different angles. I started feeling a little weak and I thought I was going to pass out. I'm literally talking to myself in my head and I'm like, Genevieve, you have waited your entire life for this. And now you want to pass out? I don't think so. You better hold it together here. I looked over at the NCOIC of the mortuary and I said, I need to use the restroom. Can I go to the bathroom? And he said, oh no, once you're in the room, you can't leave. And he said the look on my face, he said, he thought I was going to, like I'd seen a ghost. Like my reaction was like, what? I'm stuck here. And so he's like, no, I'm just kidding. Just take off all of your PPE and just make sure you re-robe before coming back in. So I go in the bathroom and I really didn't have to go to the bathroom, by the way. I needed to collect myself. And I was breathing. I was talking to myself and telling Genevieve, you got to put yourself together. You got to get back out there. You can do this. You're a soldier, buckle up, Buttercup, let's do this. And I went out, I started to get ready to go back into the double doors that would have led me into the autopsy room. And I felt a wave of dizziness again. I said, oh, I'm not ready. Let me go sit. Let me just sit down in some fresh air for a little bit. The fresh air of the room, not the bathroom. And so I sat, and there was this clerk typing away on a typewriter. And there was another set of double doors. And as I was sitting there listening to the clicking sounds of the typewriter, I could hear this very faint humming sound. It was a melody, and it was the most beautiful voice that my ear was beginning to tune into. And I thought, wow, that's coming from behind those double doors. And in that moment, and I can tell you, I do not know how, why, what provoked this elder gentleman to come out through the double doors. The door opens, and there's a short-statured, older gentleman with a rubber apron on. He peeks out the door. He looks to his left. He looks to his right, and he looks right at me. He said, would you like to come in? And I was like looking around, like, is he talking to me? And I mean, obviously he is, because it's obviously not the clerk at the typewriter. And I said, yes. I mean, this is what dreams are made of. But this was my reality in that moment. And I walked in the room, and there he was standing over an infant. And he was preparing this beautiful little infant to be shipped back to the United States. And he was singing this infant a lullaby. And I stood over that infant in that moment, and I said, wow, this is the infant I have been looking for since I was 7. And I looked up at him and I said, excuse me, sir, can I ask you, what do you do? And he said, I'm a funeral director. And in that moment, my circle had been complete. And I knew in that moment that that's what I needed to be. Because in the other room was the pathologist that I thought I wanted to be. And in the room next door was the funeral director that I ended up being. I don't even think you can write a fiction novel as good as my reality is. It was just so poignant. And that I walked out, and I knew in that moment that I was going to be a funeral director.
How much later did it take you to become a funeral director?
Well, right after that, I started looking online for courses on becoming a funeral director. They had some external courses because, of course, again, virtual classes and stuff via a computer didn't exist. But they had all these like modules that they would send you, and you'd complete the module and send it in, and they'd send you your certificate, you know. And so in Germany, I started that. It was from the United States. They would send me the books. I'd complete it, and it was a funeral directing class. So that was my first exposure. And then I got involved with ADAC, which is the Association of Death Education and Counseling. And I started really absorbing myself in different courses that could certify me and make me a better death care professional, if you will. And while I was in my research with ADAC, I realized that there was a school to be a funeral director, and it was Commonwealth Institute of Funeral Services in Houston, just down the street where my ex-in-laws lived. And I was like, at the time they were my in-laws. And I was like, oh, this is perfect. So I had just got my paperwork approved to extend my tour in Germany by another 3 years. When you do that, they give you the opportunity to go home and visit your family. And so we did. And when we were in Houston, I came over to Commonwealth and met a wonderful lady named Patsy, and she was the registrar, and I filled out my paperwork. And I said, when I'm done with my contract with the government, I'll be here. She said, okay. Every year she would call me in Germany. Are you still coming? Yes, I still have 2 more years. I'll be there. Keep my application. And she did it every single year until I was up and eligible to ETS after 12 years in the Army. And I got out and I became a funeral director. And I have to give credit to Mrs. Poorman, who worked at the Launchstall Mortuary, because I interviewed her as well and told her, okay, tell me my steps. What do I got to do to be a funeral director? You know, and she was a great mentor for me, and that paved my path. And I was in school as a funeral director, and the museum is attached to Commonwealth Institute of Funeral Services. And they would always come to the schoolhouse and say, oh, we need some volunteers at the museum. And I would raise my hand, always volunteering, because you never know where volunteering leads. And they needed help hanging lights. And so I would get up on the scaffolding and hang up the lights. And I met the then president, Mr. Bedeker, and Lucy, who was basically the a manager, if you will, over the museum. Got to know them. And then they were expanding the museum to house some more exhibit space. And my final project in restorative art, I chose to do St. Pope John Paul, because I was either going to do Princess Diana or I was going to do Pope John Paul, because they had just recently deceased and very well known and recognizable individuals. So I wanted to put myself to the test, because for people that don't know about restorative art, it's the opportunity to restore the features of your loved one so that the families can say goodbye. I feel in my heart of hearts that seeing is believing. And it's part of the grieving process. It helps the grieving process begin. It helps you rationalize it in your head. Maybe not that day, maybe not weeks after, but you're able to look back and say, yes, that was my loved one. And yes, they are deceased. And my heart goes out to all of those who don't get that opportunity, because their loved ones are lost forever. Their loved ones were never returned for one reason or another. That leaves a void in the grief process. So I find that, yes, I'm having an open casket for my mother, because to me, that's important. There are people that haven't seen my mother. They need that reality. Yes, she's here. Yes, she's deceased. So I find that important. It might not be applicable to everybody, but as a death education advocate, it's important to me. And so in the restorative art class, you have to restore the features that might get damaged from an accident, might be, succumbed to their medical conditions. And so it's important to be able to restore those features, focusing mainly on the face and the hands, because those are your most recognizable features on your body. People hold your hand, people see your face. It's what we touch. It's our human connection. And so that is very important. So I ended up doing Pope John Paul II. And I remember for my project, he must have sat on our kitchen table for 3 weeks. And my kids were like, Mom, when are you going to finish this project? Because every day he's looked more and more real and his eyes are going to open. And finally, I was able to present it to class, unbeknownst to me that was actually going to be part of my resume in my interview, of my abilities to be artistic, but as well as pay attention to detail, because I feel also in our profession, paying attention to detail is very, very important. We're very detail oriented, not only for what the family's seeing, but what's important to the family. And I felt like I possessed a lot of that, and that those were qualities I felt was not only instrumental in being a funeral director, death care professional, but also a death care advocate and being able to run the museum. Because I do have a balance here at the museum that I have to maintain. I have to be able to look at the entertainment side of it, but I also have to look at the respect side of it. And so my restorative art project ended up being part of my resume, and I ended up being the project manager over the expansion of the museum.
So I want to hear about, and you told me before a little bit about the beginnings of the National Museum of Funeral History, and started through the funeral director. I don't know if it was a couple of funeral directors or if it was a group of them. You'll have to remind me. But did you practice as a funeral director outside of the museum, or has your practice been enveloped within the museum the whole time?
So my practice has been enveloped basically within the museum, basically in the educational realm.
Okay.
I also have done things on I had my military experience of working with the dead, but also for the last 20 years, I was a palliative nurse at the VA Medical Center. And so I was there at the time of death. I was caring for them in their terminal processes. I also helped to educate the family on what to expect from the dying process, help them understand what their loved one was going through, help them open up to the concept that their loved one is going to die and embrace it, and really help them through that journey for the last 20 years.
So that's something you still do.
I retired in January. Yeah. It was time. It was time to retire. But yeah, so most of my funeral directing profession itself has been focused on the museum and educating, curating exhibitions, being able to tell a story about death, customs and rituals, disposition, the history of our industry, all of that through exhibits.
So tell us about the beginning of the National Museum of Funeral History and then its evolution.
Yeah. So I always say that, and when I use this word inherit, I don't mean an inheritance as in passed down by the family. I mean it as in a gift that was given to me, not monetarily at all. This has nothing to do monetarily. It has everything to do with the concept of inheriting somebody's vision, their hopes and dreams of having a place to house the history of our industry. And that came from the mastermind, Mr. Waltrip. Mr. Waltrip was also the founder of Service Corporation International. And it was during his time of developing his corporation, he was seeing that a lot of the items, the tools of our trade, were unfortunately being discarded into our landfills. And it's because what are you going to do with a cooling board that once held a dead body, or an embalming machine that was used on the dead? Any of the tools of our trade that were used on the dead. Nobody wants that unless you're in the industry and you have a special niche collection, right? So with that, it has to be housed somewhere. At that time, it was landfills. And he said, no, we need to have a museum. We need to have a place where we can showcase these items and really talk about the history of our industry, because our industry, believe it or not, has been around since we began dying. I mean, in America, it's more recent, the historical beginnings, but throughout the entire world, we've been having customs and rituals surrounding death since the moment we began breathing. They always say you die, the moment you are born, you begin dying. We're all born to die. It's the reality of life. And so the museum in 1992 broke ground and opened up. And it kind of started out as a nice warehouse looking collection of somebody's cars, right? Bunch of historical hearses from all different time periods. If you don't know what a hearse is, it's actually the vehicle used to carry the body from place of death to their final resting place. And they come in the form of a sleigh, a horse-drawn buggy, handheld cart, to motorized hearses, to trains. There's a bunch of different forms of transportation that are classified as hearses, as well as family cars that carry the family.
In my last series, I talked to a group up in Washington State called Recompose, where it was basically human composting. And they talked a lot about how often, like on almost every flight, there's a dead body. So is an airplane considered a hearse if it's holding a dead body?
No, I wouldn't consider the airplane a hearse. We consider that commercial transportation because there's way more live people on there than there are dead people.
Okay.
So basically a hearse is a vehicle specifically designed to carry the dead body to their final resting place. Yes. An airplane isn't specifically designed to carry
That's
a body.
right.
It's designed to carry people and luggage. But
Okay.
unfortunately, yes, they do from time to time carry the dead body. And you're right. A lot of times people don't realize that there's a dead body on the same plane as them. Rightfully so, because it's out of respect for the family, right? And the deceased.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so the museum started as a collection of hearses, and then it's grown dramatically,
yes,
over the years.
Mr. Bedecker, also a funeral director, keeping in mind this museum was created, ran, designed, and continues to run today from funeral directors. And so Mr. Bedecker was behind a lot of the design and curation of a lot of the exhibits early on in the museum. And it was basically, once people started learning in the industry that the museum existed, they started just like, oh, well, you can have this. And oh, we have this and this and this. And it was all these items over time that Mr. Bedecker was able to formulate and design specific exhibits to kind of make everything make sense, right? So you just don't have a hodgepodge of collection. Then I came on board when we were expanding the museum to add additional 10,000 square feet so we could house one of our largest exhibits, which is the Celebrating the Lives and Deaths of the Popes, which was inspired by the funeral of today's St. Pope John Paul II. And it was his funeral that really helped propel us, or I should say the designing of the exhibit because of his funeral is what really helped set the museum on the map and really put it where it belonged in the world of museums as a profound educational institution.
So the museum started in 1992. It began with a collection of hearses. It grew over time as funeral directors would donate items for exhibits, but there was always a focus, and the museum has always been run by funeral directors to make it a cohesive experience. And it's grown dramatically over time. I know you've overseen at least a 10,000 square foot expansion. I believe you have 19 permanent exhibits, and then you sometimes have traveling or temporary exhibits. So tell us about that evolution and how you decide when an exhibit becomes permanent and then when you accept sort of, a temporary exhibit.
When I first started, we already had some exhibits in the pipeline, if you will, that we wanted to create. But as I began to really learn my job, I started listening. I would always just walk through the museum and have an ear to the public and just get their reactions and try to gauge what it is that they were wanting to see. And so listening to the public and having a sign-in book when you come into the museum and giving us your feedback was very helpful and instrumental in me creating additional exhibits for the museum. The cremation exhibit being probably the most popular request by public demand, if you will. We didn't have anything on cremation and they wanted to know more about cremation. So that really was something that I put on the forefront of my plate. A lot of the custom and rituals from different parts of the world, that actually culminated out of us expanding the space, creating the Pope exhibit, which is very focused in Rome and Italy, and the customs and traditions surrounding the rituals of burying a pope. And so I kind of created that whole international section. And that's really kind of spearheaded the international customs and rituals that can embrace that space. Unfortunately, I'm now at a point in my career within the museum that I'm out of space. Spatially challenged. The 19 permanent exhibits that are currently housed have a lot of great information for the visitors, really covers a lot of the subjects, but I always like to bring in temporary exhibits whenever I can. One of my very moving temporary exhibits is the 9/11 exhibit, and it's going to come out and make another debut next year on the 25th anniversary. And what makes up this exhibit and what makes it so poignant and moving is that the exhibit is made up of memorial books. If you don't know what a memorial book is, it's when you attend a funeral, you go in and you sign in as the guest, right? And you are forever captured at that funeral. And so that's the memorial book. And unbeknownst to the nation, people around the world, on September 11th, it was a very moving time for everybody. For those of that can remember that day, know exactly what they were doing on that day. They can give you a play-by-play, a moment by moment, almost down to the second, because it was such a tragic event that we all can remember. Service Corporation International, one of the large corporations throughout the nation, saw that we were a nation in grief. And at that time, they had ordered all of their funeral homes to put out a memorial book for the nation to come and pay their respects and sign their name into the books, share their story, share their memory in these books. And so these books were out for a good month and a half. And there was a memorandum that was put out that on October 18th, all the books were to be collected and sent down to 1929 Allen Parkway. And all those books from all around the nation, to include Canada, got collected up. And then I came along. Unbeknownst to me, there was these boxes with these books inside these black trash bags because it needed protection, right? So it was wrapped in plastic. So there was these books inside boxes wrapped in plastic, and I didn't know what they were. And so as I was reorganizing our archival space that holds all of our artifacts that aren't out on display, I came across this box and I opened it up, and it was very musky, and a little dust came billowing out of the bag, just like in the movies. And I was like, whoa, what is this? And I opened up one of the books, not realizing what I was holding in that moment. I was holding history in my hands and not realizing the impact. I had a couple of my staff. I said, okay, open up all these boxes. I want to know what's in all of these boxes. And we have this large classroom, and it filled every single table in stacks and stacks. And we had so many memorial books with so many amazing stories. And I collected them up and I organized them into a profound exhibit. I had so many memorial books that I was able to create 2 twin towers, stood 3 feet high, and still had enough left over to line the walls in stacks. And all of those books held a nation in grief. But the exhibit was about the stories that were being told and the actual events and how they unfolded, because we had learned so much more at the time that I had done this exhibit. I was able to really put pieces together, and I must have watched, probably 20 videos over a week period. It was so heavy. I relived the grief all over again, researching this exhibit so that I could get all the facts right and I could put it into an informational format so that when people came, either they could appreciate that moment in life, or those who never experienced it could learn from it. It was a really great exhibit, and I'm really honored to be able to showcase it once again in 2026. We had a Batmobile here at one time, and we were honoring George Barris, who was the creator of the Batmobile. And it just so unfortunately happened that the original Batman, and forgive me that I do not recall his name at this time, he also died in that same year. So we were able to memorialize him as well. We also had the car of Roy Rogers in one of his movies here, and we were able to showcase Roy Rogers. I got to talk with his son. His son was just the sweetest of persons. He donated a lot of stuff, personal stuff, to help expand the exhibit beyond just the car. Got to tell Roy Rogers' story, so it was great. So sometimes people will come along and bring me items that allows us to either commemorate an anniversary or celebrate a moment in time that other people can relate to. And that's where our temporary exhibits come from.
And of the permanent exhibits, so you talked about the Pope exhibit. I know another one of the well-known exhibits is the most famous burial of all time, the Shroud of Turin. Is that right?
Yes.
And you have exhibits on Dia de los Muertos, jazz funerals, which is how we found you, and I really want to hear about, and a Ghana coffin exhibit. So I guess you're done with permanent exhibits. You have 19 of them. How did you decide these are the ones that should be permanent?
It wasn't me deciding whether they were going to be permanent or not. They just held so much great information that was kind of like green information, right? It's not commemorating an anniversary of somebody. It's not a moment in time that we're expanding upon. These are cultural rituals. These are actual celebrations of life, ways that we are caring for our dead even today. So they're basically green exhibits. What happened 100 years ago is still happening today.
Yeah.
So they still hold a permanent place in our lives today. So therefore, they don't deserve to go away. They're not slated to go away because of the wealth of information they are still providing today.
And how many people come to the museum, say, on an annual basis?
We get anywhere between 35 to 40,000 people a year.
And do people give you feedback? Who's coming to the museum, and what are you hoping they take away from it? And do you know what they're taking away from it?
So when I first started, a lot of our visitors were senior citizens on a mystery tour, which I didn't appreciate being the mystery tour, or they were people who had a loved one in the industry, or they were people that were fascinated with the concept of death. There's a culture of people, I don't know if they still are identified as the goth culture, but people that tend to live on the darker side of life and embrace death, perhaps for the morbidity that death is. That was like the majority of our visitorship. Didn't see much kids. There were certain cultures that we didn't see because to them, death is taboo. And now that I have been able to shift that paradigm, and it took me over 10 years to shift the paradigm in the community and in the nation, that I'm seeing families come in and having that opportunity to talk about death. Our children are being exposed to death in cartoons. Okay, so at a very young age. And my undergraduate degree is in psychology, and psychological impact of death on children was my emphasis. Knowing that a child can understand the concept of death as early as the age of 2. They don't know what it's called. They don't understand the emotions attached to it, but they understand that something is absent, right? So we also are utilizing cartoons to entertain our children. And if you think about it, cartoons always have a character in it that's died. Walt Disney was fascinated with death, so much so that A lot of his stories, parents die and their characters are orphans. It's a good and a bad thing because you're exposing that child to the most inevitable event of life, right? So being able to come to the museum and helping a child understand what death really looks like, right? Because I think what we're finding is there's this disconnect in our ability to understand the effects of death and the emotional impact of death, because you get desensitized from the entertainment value of it. Watch your news tonight. I can tell you that somebody's going to be reported dead. 1, 2, 3 people, if not more. Every news segment, there's death. And I always do a news fast because it's too much. So the museum is an opportunity to come and talk about it in a more intimate level, get people more in touch with it in a more natural, neutral environment. And so that what I always hope for my visitors when they come here is that they walk away knowing that death is part of life and that they learn to embrace the concept of death, and therefore they live a fuller life because they know that we will all die one day.
Yeah.
That's my hope. Every day that somebody walks into the store, they walk in going, wow, I did not know all this existed in here, but please walk away knowing that this is life and this is what we're born to do. We're born to die.
Thanks for listening to an episode of On the Table with Ashley. Subscribing to, rating, and reviewing our show helps us to continue to make quality episodes. So please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts.
Thank you for joining me today on this podcast, and I hope that you will share this episode with family and friends. We look forward to any feedback you have to offer by giving us a review on Apple or Spotify. And always remember, any day above ground is a good one.